So we're going to build out a Bootstrap Navbar in our page next. So a Navbar is the top element on the page, very common in pages now. We'll build something here. We're going to look at the documentation here and components and the Navbar. And you see the code here and for it. And we can just copy this code and paste it in, and you get a Navbar that looks somewhat like this. Look at this menu here. Responsive design, so that when you have more space, the menu spreads out, and when it collapses, you have this what's called a hamburger menu, context menu that breaks out here. And we could just copy this code and we'd have this. We're going to do this. We're going to identify elements of this piece by piece, so you'll start to understand how to pull apart Bootstrap documentation and examples, and use them on your own with some understanding and flexibility. So let's analyze this. First of all, there's this nav div here, or nav element here, that is surrounding the entire thing. And this indicates that a navigation menu is going to appear here. There's not too much else to it in CSS or in HTML. It's almost like a div tag, but it does semantically mean that you're going to get a navbar there. So as I said, we could start this and copy it and have this navbar instantly, but let's build this out slowly. So the heart of the HTML here is this unordered list here. So these list items are appearing, the list items of the navbar are appearing in this unordered list, as we can see here, with anchor tags inside of it, home tag here, and some other things that we see showing up on the list. So we're going to start out with the unordered list. So I have the HTML for an unordered list here, and you can see the results here on an unordered list. I know this is going to be a navbar, so I want something like a link, so I have these as anchor tags, but with no styling. And we're going to use this as a guide here, this example, and we're going to get something that looks like what's on Bootstrap here. This responsive, again, responsive. Let's go to a full page, and you can see that it's responsive with a contracting menu there, known as a hamburger, and we'll get something that looks like this at the end. So the first thing we'll look at is the class here, navbar, and then within our unordered list, the navbar nav, and then within the list item, nav item. Let's implement those three classes in our example and see what our look. So now I've taken my unordered list. I've surrounded it with a nav class, which is again like a div, with the class navbar on the outside, and then navbar nav on the unordered list itself, and then the list items have nav items. So the effect of these three major classes, so as we work from the left to the right here, you have more and more classes being applied through Bootstrap. This is the major element, and then we get different characteristics as we go down. Here's our initial list, and we have a lot. It looks a lot better. It's vertically oriented, and we'll look at horizontal orientation next. But it's looking better. So I've copied this class from the navbar class into my code here, and this is the critical thing here. This has to do with the colors of it. We'll talk about that later. It's a light navbar with a light background. This navbar expand LG is what's important here, and what we start to see the first elements of responsive elements in Bootstrap. So there's the idea of large, medium, small in Bootstrap, and those refer to screen sizes, and those are also called breakpoints. At which point do you go and essentially navbar expand means go horizontal. So let's look at our page. So this is this is considered is not large yet. So as we make this bigger, you'll eventually see it goes to from a vertical orientation to a horizontal organization. It doesn't look right yet, but we can see the beginning of responsive design, and it's through these Bootstrap elements that add screen sizes here. And that's throughout Bootstrap. Now further adding the class nav link to the anchor elements, I get, when it goes horizontal, it gets better look. So we have our light background, light screen, and we now have our links looking a lot better. Now I've changed my navbar expand to SM just for some convenience here. I want to be able to keep it the screen relatively small and still be able to work with it in this look here. So at the small breakpoint, now it goes horizontal instead of vertical. It still goes vertical when it gets small. When it gets smaller than small, it goes vertical. We'll get into more of these breakpoints later, but for now, look at that behavior. The next element we're going to add to our navbar is the brand, and there's documentation for it down here on the Bootstrap. It says the navbar brand can be applied to most elements, but the anchor tag works best, so that's what we're going to do. So adding this navbar brand to an anchor tag, just say navbar, that's our brand. We are the navbar. Then we get this, which has a common look to it. Now we want to move this over to the right-hand side of the page, getting separation between the brand and our navbar. So I've added the class margin left auto to the unordered list, and this gives it a margin left auto, which means take as much space as possible. So it's still responsive. As I shrink the screen, the margin shrinks as well, and we can still see that it's going vertical here. So the next thing we'll do is do a collapsing menu here, so this disappears behind the hamburger icon, so-called. We'll see that next. So now let's take a look at the behavior of our menu, or our navbar here. So we have this collapse menu to the hamburger, and we can expand it out, and it goes vertical here. Good for websites or mobile sites, mobile pages. And again, using the Bootstrap documentation as our guide, I've marked up the HTML necessary to apply those classes. There were a few things I needed to do. If you look at here in the example, there's the button that this becomes, a navbar toggler. The button is a type button. The data toggle is collapse, and then the data target, very important here. This notice this is a pound sign. Recall that that's a call out to an ID. And we have here the ID that's down here on the div. So we added a div to the unordered list, calling out this ID. That allows this to be populated when the hamburger menu to be populated when it collapses to it. And then we have here the toddler icon. That's actually the look of the hamburger button. Then we have essentially this collapse, a navbar collapse styles added to this div, so that it surrounds this unordered list and tells it what is to collapse. So if you put actually elements outside of this div, those would be elements that weren't part of the collapse. Let's look at it in our code. It's just over here. So again, using the Bootstrap documentation, I have navbar type equal button collapse, and then I call out the target navbar content, and then I have this class navbar content, which surrounds the content that I want to collapse. So we've used the Bootstrap documentation to create our navbar, and we did it piece by piece, understanding each piece as we went. And you can understand that's the way to study Bootstrap. They have lots of examples. You can copy the code directly and then start pulling out pieces of it and seeing what each individual piece does. And that by understanding what each individual piece does, you'll be able to apply Bootstrap flexibly rather than just, like, say, copying code and pasting in it and filling in your own content. So I started with the unordered list as my core element, as my navigation element with anchor tags in between. I have the, from the working outside in, I use the navbar, and then the navbar nav for the unordered list, and then nav item here, and then down to the anchor tags, nav link, as we saw, that was necessary to get the links separated and looking good. But those are the four classes that were the basic classes. And then we added this anchor tag navbar brand to become the navbar brand here. We added a button here, the navbar toggler, that data toggle collapse and then targets the navbar. We had to add a div to the outside of the navbar in order to target that with the matching ID here, and then collapse, navbar collapse, which tells it to collapse as the screen shrinks. All right, so the larger lesson is to learning how to apply Bootstrap. There's rich sets of examples. You can copy and paste them and fill in your content, but you can also pull them apart and start to understand how Bootstrap works.